I've acquired a couple of massive walnut cookie slabs that are 6 inches thick. They are way too big for any tool in my shop, so today we're gonna build a machine to flatten them. This video is brought to us by Squarespace. I assumed it would be straightforward and quick. Turns out there are a few unexpected things about building a router sled that aren't obvious until you're deep into it. We have all of our pieces cut, and I want to be able to use this jig for future projects, so it needs to be modifiable. And right now our slab thicknesses are around 7 inches thick. So our guide rails need to be lifted up to allow for that thickness. But in the future, I want to be able to take away our spacers to lower it. And I went with the thicker 20 millimeter guide rails instead of the 16 to make sure there was absolutely no flex in there, because, you know, I'm going to be bridging the gap here. That is my thought process. You need 2 rails this way, and then you need 2 rails this way, and it's a big Etch-a-Sketch. Typically, if I'm making a jig, I would glue everything together, but again, I don't want it to be permanent, so I'm just going to screw these together so we can make it modifiable for the future. You know, you really should use Robertson screws. They don't do that. Those are my least favorite screws. You might be very concerned about all of these being perfectly at the same height and your platform being the same height. So when you go to flatten your boards, everything is perfectly flat. For what I need, I just need it to be good enough. The Department of Weights and Measures is not going to come into my shop, measure my cookie flatness. Every time. I broke the bit inside the wood. There used to be a bit on there. So they're not all same height. And I know I got done saying earlier that I wasn't completely concerned with them all being the same height, but I mean, that's off by a 32nd. I can fix that. That's a quick fix. I would never advise anybody to run plywood through your planer, especially with screws in there. But I wanted to take a chance. I do advise you on taking more chances though. Because I went with the heavier one, that wasn't planned. Because I went with the heavier one, the one with a 20 millimeter shaft, instead of the 16, there's no bend to it. Right now it's kind of rocking on there. I think it's gonna pull the plywood flat when I screw it together. That's the advantage of paying $10 more a rail for the 20 over the 16. I can't attach any rails permanently yet, because if we just screw down this rail and then that front rail, how do we know they're even perfectly parallel? So we have to get these guys perfectly parallel. Then we run these over the track to perfectly parallel the other pair. I now need to transfer this whole pattern to this guy. We'll put some tape over this. We can do a little impression on there and then mark where we need to drill holes. Then I can drill out that whole pattern. That's the quick and dirty way to make a template. If you don't have tape, you could always just use your laser cutter and then cut them out on the laser. And so we're going to clamp this down. All of the holes have to be drilled oversized because we need that play when we go to assemble everything. It'll square itself up and then we can slowly start tightening things down. All 4 rails not attached, but we have some of this cool action. This is where the router is gonna go. So the router can go this way, and then we can move the whole assembly this way. But to do this, we're gonna use this aluminum L channel thing, and the router is gonna sit in here. So let's go cut this down. I think it's important that we get these 2 parallel first with the router jig, and then we can work on the parallelness of the front and back. And you can cut aluminum with woodworking tools. Does not hurt your tools. And then the same thing, we gotta drill the 4 holes into our router rails to hold the router. This piece of angled aluminum is going to go up here like this. I need 1 more piece that's going to attach to this so the router sits below. So I'm just gonna bolt these together to create that Z. We've got our little Z supports all installed and on the rails. Now I know some of you are screaming at your TV or computer screen saying, hey, you could use the other kind of linear rails where the bearings hang on the bottom, and I would not have had to go through all that. And that is true. But those rails are just basically like a long steel dowel rod with connectors at the end. And there's potential with the weight of the router and the workload that they could sag, because that's quite a distance right there. That's 48 inches. These type of linear rails, it's a long dowel, but it also has that solid support underneath. They are not going to sag. These are 20 millimeters. So yes, that would have been the easier route. That's probably the route you want to go if you're making something smaller. Then you wouldn't have to go through all this. But here we are. I'm happy with my decision. I made that. I had fun. So I was trying to keep this away from digital tools and trying to keep it all like DIY friendly. But for the plate, for this guy, I'm gonna go ahead and cut that on my laser. I'm so tired of drilling holes. I've drilled enough holes today. Let's have the machines do that for me. Then we're gonna countersink a couple of these guys. Let's see how that looks. That screws right to my router base. And then I 3D printed a dust collection fitting. You don't have to 3D print one. You could just buy one. But why did I get a 3D printer if I'm not gonna use it? Friction fits in there. We are good. So I chose clear acrylic so I could see what is happening. I still gotta take the paper off, but you know, you could just make a wood base. I had the robot cut 6 holes in here. That's going to be mounted in here. I already see my first mistake, and that is making these 2 brackets too long, because right now we actually lose some of our cutting capacity because it's gonna max out right there. So at a later date, I am going to remove 3 inches from there and make it the size that we need. Right now, it comes all the way to the edge, which is great. It's always down the home stretch where the things start to not go as planned. I wanted the clear acrylic base, so when I put my router on here, I can actually see what's going on. My acrylic is a 1/4 inch thick, and I can see there's some flex in there. There can't be any flex in there at all. So I'm gonna bring these in. My only worry now is this handle right here is gonna interfere with that guy. I took the original piece of acrylic and cut off the ends, made it much smaller. It's very hard to bend now. So now the rails have been moved in. And instead of the acrylic being bolted to the aluminum and then the router bolted to the acrylic, I now, with this new piece and new design, have the router bolted to the acrylic and the aluminum. So once I get this all bolted up, we have regained all of our stiffness. I have got the rails perfectly spaced and locked down. They are perfectly parallel. You tighten these down, you move this down there, and then you tighten those down, and they stay perfectly parallel. I then took the whole assembly off and then countersunk the screw holes on the bottom of the aluminum so the screws won't stick out. So now we get to attach everything together. Head is locked down. There's no deflection, there's no movement. And I think partly it was because we shortened it, mostly because we bolted the aluminum right to the router. We're good. The only problem with this design is when I loosen this handle hits this rail. 6.5 inches all the way down. We got 5.5 inches. We still have a full inch of travel. And if we need more than that, we can take off some of the spacers from the walls. We got our rails locked down. They are perfectly parallel. We've got no binding whatsoever. So we're gonna move this whole assembly over to this side, put in a screw here, put in a screw there. Then we're gonna move the whole assembly to the other side, put in a screw here, put in a screw there, and then we can fill in the middle, and everything should be perfectly parallel. All day, all day. Oh, that is nice. I will probably throw some thread lock on there just because of all the vibrations. Oh, oh, that thing is so heavy. This is the first pass. The dust collection wasn't doing anything, so we're adding some bristles here to try to get it to do something, because it's all going right in my face. Temporary solution is duct tape, which we all know is usually the permanent solution. Okay, lots of things to discuss. My dust collection is basically doing nothing. There's not much in the vac. That totally needs to be rethought. It works better on the push. On the pull, it wants to grab. We've got a lot of improvements to make. I think I know what I need to do. So let's clean up. And in the meantime, let me tell you about today's sponsor, and that is Squarespace. I've been using Squarespace for well over a decade, and you've heard me say this many times, but I used to be a web developer. Why would a former web developer want to use Squarespace? That is because Squarespace just makes my life so much easier. No longer do I have to worry about code, cloud, backend, making things talk to each other, payment processors. I don't have to worry about any of that. Squarespace just makes my life so much easier. Maybe you're a lot like me. Maybe you're a woodworker, a metalworker, a crafter, an artist, and you just need a place to show off your work. Squarespace is the perfect place to do so. They've got a number of galleries where you can show off your work. Maybe you want to sell some of your things. You can do that with Squarespace. If you're like me, maybe you make plans to the stuff that you make. You can sell both physical and digital. My merch, I don't even ship from my house. I use a third party called Printful that talks seamlessly with my Squarespace site. So I don't have to worry about inventory, none of that. I'm telling you, Squarespace just makes everything so much easier. And if setting up a new website sounds exhausting to you, don't worry about it. Squarespace is gonna ask you a few questions, and while you're answering those questions, it's gonna build your site for you in the background. And you don't even need to worry about which award-winning template you should choose, because you can just easily select a new template. And if you want to make that look like your own, you can rearrange things, you can drag things around, and you can quickly go in and change color. Visit squarespace.com, and when you're ready to launch, visit squarespace.com/makesomething to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. I made a bunch of refinements. I got a new slab here to test out all the new upgrades. First thing, you do not need clear acrylic. There is absolutely no reason to see in there, and you can't see anyway. So I've got black acrylic in there now. You can use a piece of wood. Clear doesn't help you in any way, shape, or form. I was using 2" by 2" angled aluminum for the router base. I swapped that out for 2" by 1.5 inches, and that now allows my router to go all the way to the bottom before the handle hits the angled aluminum. I lowered the plywood walls and added these 1/4" spacers up here because this is a more elegant system of raising and lowering the whole unit instead of trying to take off all the plywood walls. I still have the option of adding and taking off plywood walls, but for quick 1/4", 1/2", 3/4" inch changes, I can just swap out these 1/4" spacers here. They don't need to be acrylic. That just looks cool. In my head, I did come up with a way to raise and lower the whole thing. Imagine there's threaded rod on each corner, and then that threaded rod has a bicycle gear on there, and then there's a chain that goes to all 4 corners, and then there's a knob on one, and turning that knob lowers and raises the whole unit so you can get whatever size slab in there that you want. I never tested that out. That is just complete overkill, but that actually would be pretty cool. There's gonna be some challenges with a sled this big. You'll need some extra tensioners in there so the chain is not drooping. Also, I don't know if you would actually be able to raise and lower the whole thing with your hand muscles, with your tiny little hand muscles. But in my head, that's a really cool, elegant system that I have no plans on doing ever. I made this dust housing that auto levels depending on the thickness of your boards. This just sits on top of the wood and then self levels depending on the thickness. So watch it drop down, comes back in, lifts up. It's got longer, stiffer bristles, and I also doubled them up. This should be much better than the previous dust shroud that we made. And then I moved the dust collection port closer to the router and angled it as well, so it's pointing right at the bit. I also found that the Festool dust collector has a lot more suction than this orange one. The Festool also has a bigger hose, so this is really going to help with my dust collection. Fin? F-E-I-N? F-I-E-N? I don't remember. Anyway, the more expensive one is better. Who would have thought? The hardest part of this entire build was making this router mount right here. And after I made it, I realized you can just buy this on Amazon. You don't need a laser cutter, and you don't even need to buy the angled aluminum. Even with all of these upgrades, there's no way to make the dust collection perfect unless you enclose the whole thing. So the next best solution is to cover it with vinyl. And this is still not going to be perfect, but it should keep most of the dust contained. The super fine, harmful dust is still going to get up in the air, so you're going to need an air filter and a respirator, or take the whole thing outside. And don't worry, it's not airtight, so the router and the dust collector can still work properly. I did add this box fan with a HEPA filter on here below my dust collector so it can try to get as much of the fine harmful dust as possible. The reason the first slab was so dusty was because we were routing end grain. Long grain slabs are going to have more shavings. End grain is just harder to route, and it's always going to create dust. That's just the nature of the beast. I did replace all of the nuts with lock nuts so it doesn't come undone with vibrations. I assumed I was going to have to shim the router and that it wouldn't plane perfectly flat. Maybe I just got lucky, maybe I did it right, but I did not have to shim anything and it routes perfectly flat. Two rails have the stop collar on there, and then the other two rails have two washers underneath the bolt that acts as a stop so my router can't fall off the sled. The absolute max slab I can flatten is 38 inches wide, and the length is 48 inches, but I could do a section, slide the slab over, and then do another section, so technically that's infinite. I will take this apart for storage. I'll keep all of the walls, and then I can just attach this to any sheet of plywood in the future. I will not have plans for this sled, but I will have very detailed photos for my Patreon members, and if you happen to have the same router, I'll provide the template for that as well. And speaking of Patreon, I would like to thank my top members this month: Letters to Words, Master of None, Annie from P10 Workshop, Jeremy Johnstone, Jim Salmons, BJ Smith Art, Chris Hoffman, Jason Ramos, X2 Crafted Chaos, Glenn Rogers, Kalo 3D Prints, and Chris from ZahooX.com. You should check them out. I actually have a couple of their products. I'd like to thank my buddy Kondo for supplying the walnut cookie slabs. You're a good man, dude. The very first slab that we flattened, that walnut cookie, I've got some pretty big plans for that. I'm going to remove the centerpiece and replace it with a piece of chrome metal and then make a metal base for it. So it's going to be like this 5-foot tall sculpture. I've talked about it in detail on my podcast called Making It with Jimmy Duressa and Bob Claggett. That is going to wrap it up. As always, be safe, have fun, stay passionate, and make something.